You ever meet that person that just seems to have life figured out? What's up, guys? Marshall here. And on today's podcast, we definitely have one of those guys. Our guest today has been able to absolutely master his spot in the podcasting niche by taking a process that can be daunting and complex and downright time consuming, and he packages it into a well-oiled content creating monster. This is going to be one of those that you're going to want to save and come back to over and over again, because the podcasting knowledge is about to be dropped, my friends. Welcome to episode 102 of the Serial Progress Seeker podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to the Serial Progress Seeker podcast, your ultimate destination for unlocking the secrets to building a successful podcast. Each week, we gather a community of experienced podcasters, industry experts, and trailblazers to discuss everything from growing your listener base to generating revenue to the latest industry trends, plus a whole lot more. Okay, Serial Progress Seekers, let's get started with the show.
All right, Ben, I'm excited. We've got a fun episode coming up today. I'm really pumped for us to jump into this. We have brought this special guest on for very specific audience members, right? So we're specifically talking to all of our entrepreneurial audience, all of our audience that are podcasters out there, all the people that are, maybe they own a business and they're thinking about getting into podcasting, and they've got this dream of, okay, I've got this whole idea, I've got this whole niche that I know that I can really dial into, but I don't know how to take it to the next level. How do I get this thing started? How do I get it off the ground? We've got somebody here with us today that can help with that and knows exactly how to run you through that and can build your roadmap for you and stuff. So we're really excited to be able to talk with our guest today. So I got to tell you, so our guest, his name is Richard Matthews. He is from PushButtonPodcasts. It's an amazing company. If you haven't checked it out, believe me, we're going to be dropping plenty of links in the show notes and things like that. But check this out, Ben. As I was getting to know Richard prior to the show, I found out a few fun facts about Richard that I don't know if you even know. So, and this, it's weird because he has so many skills. Oh my God, it's unbelievable. So Richard is a preacher. He's a photographer. He's a pianist. He's an electrician. He's a windsurfer. He's a juggler. He's a plumber, and I literally had to cut this list off because it kind of kept going and going and going. But specifically today, the guy that we are talking to is a wildly successful businessman with an awesome story. I'm going to turn it right over to you because you know Richard from way back, and I'd love to know about how you got to know Richard, and then we'll introduce him and we'll ask him a few questions and pick his brain a little bit.
This is going to be one of my favorite episodes, and I'm just going to call it right now. And the reason is because this is just a human that I love. Richard and I kind of, when you do what I do, and I've been, teaching for a long time online, that's been sort of my thing. And from the time I was in the chiropractic office to just being completely full-time online, doing podcasts, doing all the things, Richard's one of those names that just kind of kept popping up. And so we would kind of see each other online and, we'd run into each other here and there. But there was one particular instance where I was speaking in Las Vegas. And I was doing this thing, and I just remember, a lot of times, you at that point you were kind of running with a certain speaking crew, so the same speakers would show up, and then like sometimes my family would come out with me. This is one of those where I was like completely alone, and I knew a lot of people there, but it was a very different sort of situation for me. And I just remember like there was one particular evening where we all just kind of ended up hanging out, and I got to really talk to Richard more than I ever had before. And like I said, we talked, but this was more like we had time to actually talk. And so very quickly I realized that Richard is much smarter than me. So that was the number one thing that hit me. But number two, this was somebody that was incredibly interested in helping people. And that's always sort of my criteria. There's a lot of really talented people out there. But they're not always as interested in, helping the other folks get where they want to go. And, that's sort of the line for me is like, I want to surround myself with the people that sort of have both of those qualities. Really talented, can help a lot of people, but then they're actually interested in helping people too. And it's not just about the money. It's not just about themselves. And so, Richard and I, we started to kind of, bond over that. But the real thing is like, we we bonded so much that we kind of got this group together. And we put this group of people together in this little small mastermind. And over the next few years after that, we all started getting together. And some very interesting things came out of that mastermind. One of the things that was thrown out at the mastermind was this interesting idea for a business at the time. And I remember sitting in the room and, hearing this idea from Richard of something that he wanted to do. And just being very taken back by like how smart this was and what a huge need this was. And so today, when we get into this, and we're going to bring him on now so that we can hear him talk and talk about this, but we're going to talk about sort of the origins of Push Button Podcast, what the heck that actually is, and the huge problem that it solved. And along the way, if you're a podcaster or you're looking to become a podcaster, you're going to pick some things up that immediately are going to make you a better podcaster or are going to help you grow your podcast. Just because when you sort of realize what Richard does and kind of how this comes together and kind of how he built this, which podcasting was a very big part of this actually, which we can go into. You're going to really learn a lot about why I'm going all in on podcasting. And this is something that I've invested a lot of time, a lot of money in. Why Richard has gone all in on podcasting and really where we're going with podcasting in the next little bit. And I think it's very interesting what Richard does and the value that he brings to podcasters. And rather than continue to set this up in a poor way, I want to bring Richard on and chat with him. Richard, it's good to see you, buddy. I'm glad you're here. Tell us about Push Button Podcast, what it does and how it helps people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many things we can talk about. Which, by the way, the whole like list of skills thing, it cracks me up. I tell people I collect skills the way other people collect coins, and I do actually. Like, I built my desk custom, so like if I push in my keyboard drawer, I can actually pull out my keyboard, and I have a piano sitting here at my desk.
Nice.
So that's a super nerdy thing. And the juggling is a new skill. In the last like 3 or 4 weeks, I've been struggling with learning to play with my left hand on the piano. And so I started learning to juggle so I could get my left hand to do what I wanted to do. Nice. It's very effective. It's like a cross training thing.
Yeah.
So that's helping me learn the piano. But anyways, Push Button Podcasts actually came about because I had it's all the way back in like 2015, which is right about when we met. Actually, I had a desire to start a podcast. The podcast was called The Hero Show, and my goal was I wanted to sort of shift this cultural narrative we have about entrepreneurs being villains, right? And every TV show you watch, every kids book TV show or movie you watch, everything is always some variation of entrepreneur spills oil on ducks for money, right?
Right.
And I've always hated that narrative because one, it's not true, and two, I think it creates a lot of cultural negativity around those of us who are entrepreneurs. And undercharging and not understanding that you're trying to build for profit and that profit can be a good thing and that profit actually helps grow and improve the world. And so I wanted to create my own podcast to shift, to sort of, have my own contribution to shift that culture narrative. And I've got theories about why we have that narrative, right? What the theory essentially is that, the best storytelling is the stuff that's on the fringes. And so the fringe stories in entrepreneurship are either the people who are really bad or the people who are really good, and bad sells better than good. So that's what all the stories are told about. But that it has the sort of the negative implications of everyone sort of looks at entrepreneurship in this negative light. So anyways, I started this podcast and I recorded the first 8 episodes, which Ben, I think you were one of the first ones on that podcast. And I recorded 8 and then I did all of the post-production work to get everything, edited and get all the videos done and get all the social media stuff done and get it all published, put out. I made it through 3 of those episodes of the 8 that I recorded.
Right.
And then I realized if I continued doing that, I was going to starve. And so the podcast actually sat and it rotted on the vine for like 2 years. And it was like 2017. And I remember it was that mastermind that one of the masterminds that you put together. And you had pulled me aside at the end of the mastermind. You're like, listen, you're definitely smarter than me, right? You said that to me at the time. You're like, but you need to hire someone in your company. And you told me who I needed to hire and what I needed to do with them. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to afford to hire someone to do any of these things. And I vacillated on that decision for a good 3 months. But then I finally just did the thing you told me to do, which was hire someone in my company. And had that immediate realization of like, oh, perspective shift now that you're on the other side. having another person on your team opens up your resources a lot, and you can get a lot more accomplished. And over the course of the next year, one of the things that we worked on, me and my first employee, who's still on my team, by the way, he's excellent. His name is Mark. And we built all the processes for that podcast, for the Hero Show. And I went from recording 8 episodes in the first couple of days to 2 years of it struggling to the next year we published 55 episodes. And publishing 55 episodes, and I didn't do anything for those 55 episodes other than show up and record.
Right.
And to this day, we're up at like 250 episodes, and I still don't do anything other than show up and record. And it was the following year we showed up at the mastermind again with your group, and I remember it was like, this is the thing that I built for my company. And then you and a few other people in the room were like, can I buy that?
Right.
I was like, buy what? And you were like, your processes for your podcast. And I was like, well, I hadn't thought about that. And it was actually in that mastermind room, we bought the domain name PushButtonPodcasts. We set up the first page, and we helped run the Digital Agency Insider podcast, which was your podcast. It was the first show that we ran with PushButton Podcasts, and your company actually helped us develop a lot of our onboarding and a lot of our first processes. And like, it's insane what we're doing now compared to what we were doing a couple of years ago. But yeah, that was actually born out of a need for myself. And then first couple of clients coming out of the mastermind there. And we have, over the course of the last couple of years, built the whole company. Now we've got 10 staff members now. I've got video editors, audio editors. We've got voice actors. We've got graphic designers. We've got the whole bit. And our entire goal is that we can take someone who runs either a local business or an online business, and they can leverage a 2-hour recording window once a month into every single week. They've got long form video podcasts that are optimized for YouTube, long form audio podcasts optimized for iTunes, and then short form content coming out 365 days a year. And the only thing that our clients need to do is show up for that one recording session. And we do everything with them, everything from helping them plan out their first years of content to helping them set up their studios, right? Like, I could probably show you guys my studio here, but I've got a couple of lights, iPhone camera, microphone, backdrop in the background. We show people how to set up their studios. We show people how to plan their content. We show people how to get their guest interviews going if they're doing that. And then they just record once a month for us, and they get content coming out all the time. And that's what we do. We're Push Button Podcasts.
Well, and I think that's the thing. If you're sitting there listening to Richard right now, maybe you haven't thought about the full opportunity of what podcasting is. And so for us, podcasting is sort of the window. It's sort of the thing where it's like, if we go stand in front of the window for a couple minutes, and like you said, it really comes down to, it's about 2 hours a month of actual staring into this window, into the world, right? And talking about something that we're an expert on. And then it's all of these things that happen because of those 2 hours that we put into this. For us, it's 2 to 4 hours a month that we actually get to sit here and talk to each other. And I think a lot of people, Richard, and you know this because me and you both felt this way when we first started. Let's go do those 2 to 4 hours, put the content out, and that's it. And everything sort of happens. And boy, wouldn't that be nice? But there's all of these things. There is this huge opportunity right now with anybody that's doing a podcast to get their expertise out in front of people. But it's what you do with the content that you put together in those 2 to 4 hours that makes all the difference in the world. And really, for most businesses out there, you're right. It's only about 2 hours, because most of the podcasts that we see people doing, it's, hey, I'm an expert on something and I'm going to come, talk about this one thing for 30 minutes. And it's 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes. And the idea behind that is, what happens? What is the machine that needs to be in place after those 2 hours are recorded to get you onto iTunes, to get you onto the other podcast networks, but to also get you onto YouTube and to get you into all of these places where you have reach. And that's the thing. I have so many
TikTok,
friends.
Instagram, Facebook.
Right. It's like we got TikTok, we got Facebook, we got Instagram now. And it's like, how do those 2 hours of recording put you in those places? And so that's the thing. I have a lot of, doctor friends. I have a lot of lawyer friends. I have a lot of restaurant owner friends too, that all of a sudden they're starting to wake up and they're starting to see, hey, I'm really good at something. And unfortunately, the thing that I'm really good at the only people that see it right now are the people that take a chance on me and pay me to come see it right in this place that I do it. And if that's your business, you are extremely limited. And so where Push Button Podcast comes in, and this is what I'm excited to talk about today, is it really takes 2 hours of your month and it starts to put this machine behind it that turns it into all these things. And so I have some questions for you. I'm going to get real specific if that's okay. When you say, because I think this is the thing, when somebody's sitting out there right now and they're like, I'm an expert at this and I got an idea for a podcast. When they come to you with kind of that level of things, what is the starting process? What does it feel like when somebody first approaches you and says, Richard, I want to do this podcast. I think this is a great medium for me, but like all this stuff that you just talked about that like I know we need because I'm on TikTok. I follow people and boy, do I get lost on TikTok. Boy, do I get lost in YouTube shorts. But Richard, in the last week, brother, I have spent so much money on things that I saw initially on TikTok. Like it was just a piece of their podcast. It was a video and they were explaining something we're good at. And I was like, I need that. Like I've been looking for somebody that does this. And it originated from that. So somebody that comes to Push Button Podcast and said, I have an idea. I have no idea how to pull this podcast off. What is the starting point for you with somebody that's just getting started, that's maybe a doctor, maybe a lawyer, and they come to Push Button Podcast and they're ready to go? What does that look like?
Well, I actually want to back it up just a little
Please
bit.
Please do, because I knew there would be a backup.
One thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand is that in the podcasting world and what we're talking about, there's two different types of podcasts. And a lot of businesses, they look at the podcast and they're thinking of the one, and they don't realize that type of podcast is not actually the type of podcast that they want to build. And so the two types of podcasts, I've coined these terms. I don't know if these are good terms or not, but I'm going to give them. One of them is the media podcast. Right. And the media podcasts, these are your big names that you're familiar with, like Joe Rogan or the Daily Wire or the Steven Crowders of the world, who are building podcasts for the intention of putting advertising in front of people. Right. They're building audience numbers to create, and then maybe they've got gated content on the other side. They got some sort of something like that. Right. Those are your big media podcasts. And when people think, how is a podcast going to help my business? They're thinking that type of podcast. And that is a business unto itself. Right? It is a podcasting business. And that is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is we're talking about this other type of podcast, which I call a strategic influence podcast, which is a podcast is a marketing channel that supports your business. Right. And so if you wanted some big names that are in this category, you might look at like Alex Hormozy or Grant Cardone, right? Where they have a business that is not their podcast. Their podcast is not a revenue driver. It is something that drives attention and drives awareness and drives strategic influence for their business where the revenue is made. And so when you start looking at it like, oh, I'm in this second category of a strategic influence podcast, how do I then leverage my podcast to create the strategic influence and create the leads and create the revenue in my business? That's what we're talking about. So I want to make sure we're framing it in that thing so people see that.
Perfect.
Yeah. And so the thing that's really important for that is to realize a couple of things. So if you're in this strategic influence category and you want to start a podcast, it's a leverage play. And so there's three types of leverage that you're going to create, right? One of them is the time leverage. We talked about that already, right? I can put in 2 hours, I can get all this work out of it, right? And so, I can get long form YouTube, I can get long form, audio podcasts, right? You want to be in iTunes, they got like 86% of the market, and then Spotify has 14% with Joe Rogan, right? So like that's those basically you want to be on iTunes, so you can create that, and then you can leverage into all of the short form content for every other social media platform. That's your first leverage, is your leverage of all the things. And then the second type of leverage, and this is really important, especially for your local businesses, is it is a leverage of high value referral partners and high value prospecting, right? Because having a podcast is the easiest yes you'll ever get in your business. Right. If you wanted to have the mayor of the town come on and talk to you, you can get them to say yes, right? The heads of the I can't remember what it's called, the like community business thing that chamber, that's what it's called, the Chamber of Commerce, right? I was like, we got a bunch of lawyers that we just recently brought on because we went and spoke at a legal event, and one of the things that a lot of them are doing is they're inviting all the other major businesses in town, the car dealerships and the doctors and the accountants and whatever. They essentially, I tell them that you elect yourself mayor of the town and then interview everyone who is anybody in your town. because they'll all
Yeah.
say yes, and then they'll be the kind of people that like everyone's going to know you. They're going to start referring business to you, right? And building that relationship. So it's a huge leverage play in terms of both prospecting and referral partners. Where if you want to get to know someone who might be a good partner or a good client for you, getting them on your podcast, interviewing you, find out what their problems are and how they're working with them, and then how you can be a good solution for them. You build that relationship really quickly. So that's the second form of leverage, and then the third form, which is what you're talking about, is the leverage that comes from actually creating all this content and showing up and creating, having that influence in the marketplace. It's going to create, I call it attention, awareness, and authority, the 3 A's, where you
Right.
can get the attention of your marketplace by showing up all the time, 365 days a year, that you become unignorable.
Right.
And you can help get people awareness of their problems, right? So that they start to move through that, Gene Schwartz of, becoming problem aware, solution aware, and product aware, and all that. That's going to happen because you're showing up in their feed all the time. And then the authority, which is like you can actually deliver it and you can give them solutions to those problems and help them move through that buyer's journey. And when that buyer's journey leverage is such an important thing, because most businesses are used to doing what you and I would call direct response marketing. And direct response marketing is, I pay a certain number of
Right.
dollars to show up in front of someone, on Facebook newsfeed or YouTube or a billboard or whatever. And the problem is like every other business in the world who solves the same problem that you do is all doing direct response marketing. So you have
Right.
someone who's in this buyer's journey and they get all the way to the end of like, hey, I'm ready to buy now. And the interaction they're going to have is going to be on the same level playing field of everyone else. It's like they're all sitting here at the end. They're going to look at all these different direct response ads and they're going to pick the one that, has the best copy, right? Now, if you have been building your podcast with a strategic influence, you've started to build a relationship with them far sooner in their buyer's journey, maybe even like the first time they became aware of their problem, right? And this entire time they go through that buyer's journey, you're showing up in their feed, you're showing up with good content. So when they get to the point where they're ready to buy, they've got a relationship with you, and you probably should still be doing the direct response marketing in your business, but now your direct response marketing comes attached to it a relationship that you've built with your content, and it makes everything you're doing significantly more powerful.
Right.
So from that aspect, when you're talking about what's the where do you start, where I start with people is I want to make sure you understand what is this thing that you're building. Because if you start looking at it as a direct response machine, or you start looking at your podcast as a media machine, you're not going to build the thing that's actually going to help you grow your business. So I always start with this conversation here of you're building a strategic influence podcast, and here's the leverage points that you have in your business because of it. Does that make sense?
No, 100%. And, man, this is the thing is like there's so many people that are starting to sort of understand this in an interesting way. I was recently on a podcast, and, you ever been on a podcast, Richard, where like the people that reached out to you were really nice and they seemed very professional, but you didn't really know why you were going in, other than, they
Yeah.
said, hey, we want you to talk about this, right? I get to the podcast. They told me what I was going to talk about. They had positioned me as an expert on a topic, but then I realized I was 100% there to meet the owner of the business that was an insurance company and to form a relationship. Now listen, when the podcast came out, they promoted the heck out of me. Like, they put me up and they lifted me up, but I had such a good experience that I was like, when this need comes up, I'm going with this business. And
Yeah.
it was such a eye-opening thing because I've been doing podcasts for a while. And yeah, like for me, podcast is my access point. Like I can get, meetings with anybody I want. I can get, a yes, as you said, with just about anybody that I want because of this podcast and because of any podcast that we've ever run before that, the digital agency insider that you started with us. That was our thing. We wanted to talk to agency owners, and this was the best way to start connecting with them at the time. And so, yeah, I think that that's the thing is that there's far too many people out there that think they have, hey, I could do a podcast, that'd be good, but they don't really have the full path of those leverage points, like that leverage that they can get. And I'm going to tell you, man, like if I would have had this mindset back when I was just starting as a chiropractor, what I would have been able to do in terms of like growing that business, I would have been able to do it 5 times faster because I would have had, this medium at my disposal. So that's the first conversation that you have with the business. And I think that's important. Go ahead.
I would just want to one of our newest clients I brought on just recently. They're a lawyer And in their town, he uses his podcast, and they're bringing us on to just do. He's like, I can finally get all this off of my plate, and
Right.
he's like, so that's what they're bringing us on for. They've been doing it for a while, and he's like, they do the whole elect themselves mayor of their town kind of thing, and
Right.
they built a podcast studio in their thing, and they invite people over, and then they always bring dinner or lunch or whatever.
I love
And
it.
so he's built his practice to. They're going to hit like $4.5 million this year,
Yeah.
with their practice. And he's like, we're on track to do $10 million next year. And he's like, it's almost exclusively due to building all the relationships with everyone in our town because of the podcast. And so like everyone comes over, and he's like, we always serve them lunch. We have a good time. We build those relationships. We build referral partnerships. We build strategic partnerships. We get clients from it. Like everything comes back to that leverage point of like, I have this podcast, and this podcast is a fantastic way to, you're hacking relationship building.
Well, that's the thing is like, the hardest thing that I ever did in the chiropractic office was getting someone to come through the door the first time. And this is what's so funny, man, is like, as I started to like get better at marketing my practice, I realized that it was less about getting potential chiropractic patients at the time that may be turned into a chiropractic patient right away to come through the door the first time. It was anybody. If I could just get somebody to cross the threshold of my front door, the chance that they would become a patient, or the likelihood that they would refer someone immediately, even if they had not been a patient already, went through the roof. And so something that we started doing very early on is we would do food drives. Like, we'd do food drives and we'd bring people through, like, and people would come by our office just to drop something off for 2 seconds, just to come through the door. But like something like this is what you're describing with your law firm client, it's an ability to sit down and break bread, but also talk. And you're right. It's like that. I'm electing myself the quote unquote mayor of the town, and I am the centerpiece. We are the party. We're throwing the party that if you are a mover and a shaker in the town, you have to be a part of this. And you're right. It's amazing how fast you can double. And I think for a lot of people, that's something they're like, can you really double a business need? Yeah. When you start to
Yeah,
make yourself the centerpiece, that's it. But you have to kind of have that excuse of, we're doing this for this reason, because people are busy. People need to see sort of where they're doing it. So it's the perfect way to do this. So Push Button Podcast. And I go ahead, keep going, keep talking.
I want to build on that a little bit, because the
Sure.
thing that's really, it's like, can you really double a business, right? My business, from that room where we bought the domain name for Push Button Podcast,
Right.
we're 10x in
Yeah.
the last couple of years.
Yeah.
10x revenue, 10x client volume, 10x the number of staff. Like we're 10 times larger than we were then, which is insane. So yes,
Right.
you can absolutely double a business. And what's fascinating about that is the when you're looking at the two different types of podcast, right? A lot of people look
Right.
at like, is my podcast successful based on number of views and downloads, right? Number of views on YouTube, number of downloads, number of people that are interacting with it. That is a media podcast metric.
Sure.
But when you're talking strategic influence, the metrics that you're looking for are not the same. And a lot of people misunderstand that, and they don't build their podcast that way. And they're like, how do I get more views on YouTube? Doesn't matter, right? My
Right.
YouTube following for our podcast, maybe 400 people a month, maybe.
Right.
And we're gonna cross $1 million a year in monthly recurring revenue this year, right?
Right.
On a very small listenership, because the listenership is irrelevant to what we're doing.
Exactly.
And so the number of download, and it's like I said, we maybe have 200 people who listen to our podcast on a regular basis. Most of my business does not come from people who watch my podcast. It comes from people who see me every single day on the internet going, you're doing something that you're showing up 365 days a year. How the fuck are you doing that? Sorry, you're gonna have to bleep me out.
No,
Right?
you're fine.
Like
Totally
it's
fine.
it's the how are you doing that kind of thing, and it's that consistency over time changes the game for a business, right?
Yeah.
And particularly if you're targeting, if any of your business is targeting millennials, Gen Z, they do this thing that I actually learned from you. They call it a heartbeat check,
Yeah.
right? Where they're gonna check and see what you look like. Are you alive on Facebook? Are you alive on
Right.
TikTok? And
Right.
if you haven't posted in the last 2 months, the last 2 weeks, as far as they're concerned, you're a dead business, right? You have no
Yeah.
heartbeat.
Yeah.
And that consistency over time, showing up all the time, showing up in the places where your people are, even if the only thing they ever see is because they just skip past your videos, they're just scrolling through like, oh, I'm not interested in I don't, I don't have any legal problems right now. But every single day they're like, they see you in your legal practice showing up. When they have a legal question, when something comes up, who are they going to call?
Right.
Right? They're going to call
Well,
you.
And I think this is the thing is like, I've told my team with the podcast, I was like, the number one thing we have to make sure that we're doing, in the last 6 months, this was the most important thing. I mean, before we actually got on, we talked about my number one problem when I was doing this by myself was consistency. I had so many good things, Richard, that were coming from doing the podcast. Like so many good relationships, so many deals got made because an episode of the podcast was the first, sort of view into my window of my world that people got. And they liked it. They liked it. But even with the numbers, Richard, of this is working for me, I could not get consistent with the podcast. And this is where we really want to like dig into where you guys have absolutely changed the game. It's you make consistency actually the easiest thing in the world for experts, and that's the thing. I think that after people sort of understand we're not building a media podcast. We are building a podcast that grants us access and gives us leverage in a very specific way. So what I kind of want to like go through a process is okay, you kind of talk with somebody, you get them kind of in the right headspace of what their podcast should actually do for them. What exactly happens? And I know we kind of touched on this before, but what exactly happens with somebody when they sign up with you and they start to sort of get the podcast put together? Can you walk me through the process of what it actually looks like? Because I think people, for you, I know what this comes off as. You're like, well, Ben, you're just, you're sales pitching my company. Anybody listening, no. If you just listen to what Richard is about to lay out for you of what they actually do, whether you sign on with Richard or not ever, this is something that will absolutely change your life when you understand this process of what happens. And so can you kind of walk me through okay, so let's assume I just signed up with you, which I have done before. And I've been through this process, but you have refined this process down to an absolute science. I've just signed up with you. What happens to me as we get going with this, and what's the process that happens from the time I sign up with you? Do I get in record right away? What happens?
Yeah, so this actually something I tell all of my customers now, which I didn't always tell them. I didn't tell you when we started this, but I tell people now. It's like everything that we do is like nothing we do is secret. There's no secret sauce to what's happening with Push Button Podcasts. We are exclusively an execution team. Right. And that's what we do is we execute for people. And what that means is it's like there's nothing secret about our processes. So I will lay out all of our processes for you, and I'll tell you ahead of time if I think it makes more sense for you to have this in your company rather than outsourcing to us. I'll tell you that. Right. And then I will just copy and paste our processes into your company because like there's nothing fancy there. It's just a set of processes we follow. And sometimes it makes more sense to have it in your company and internal, which is what you guys are doing. And a lot of times it doesn't make sense. And for those people who it doesn't make sense to have internally, it makes sense to hire someone like us to do it. It's a good place to be in for us, right? Where we're an execution arm of your company. So when someone signs up for us, there's a couple of things. We go through our onboarding process, and the onboarding process is where we create all of the assets that need to happen for the podcast. So there's a few different categories of the assets. One of them is probably there's two parts of that. We have a series on our podcast for our company. Actually, it's called the 10 Commandments of Podcasting. And the first two commandments are commandment number 1 is thou shalt have good enough production quality. And that means that your audio and your video isn't so crappy that your message gets lost, but it doesn't need to be Hollywood, right? So we go over and we talk through how do you get the 4 things you need for your podcast, which is camera, microphone, lights, backdrop. Right? Those are the 4 things. We'll actually work through and help you set that up for yourself or anyone else who is recording with you. So that's the first part. We do that. And I have a whole training. And if you actually go, it's pushbuttonpodcast.com/studio has a whole like 30-minute training on how to set up those 4 things.
Nice. We'll make sure we link to that.
I'm actually, this camera here, this is my iPhone. Right. And it's like, people, what kind of camera do you need? I used to have $10,000 worth of camera equipment that I set up. And this is now legitimately, it is sitting on one of those little MagSafe things.
Nice.
Right.
Nice.
And there's the microphone and a light and the backdrop that's behind me. And it's just snap ready to go. Right. That's my studio, as I literally just snap my iPhone on there. And, I've got a background in particular. You mentioned photography and videography. It was right around the iPhone 13 or so when the camera started to get so good that I couldn't tell the difference even as a professional. And nowadays I recommend the iPhone or the Android equivalent for for a camera. That's all you need. Super easy nowadays to get this stuff going. USB microphone, couple of cheap lights off of Amazon, this backdrop back here, this cool American flag. That's my passive aggressive patriotism, by the way. Maybe $100, $200 in equipment to get your stuff set up so you have good production quality. That's the first thing. You got to have good production quality. And the second one is the second commandment I always have is thou shalt be consistent. And what consistency means is that you're showing up every day. Right. And so how do we show up every day? And the way that we do that with the podcast is we create a weekly long form podcast and we break that into smaller bits. So what we need to do then is we need to have the next year's worth of content mapped out. So we do what's called a content mapping session, and we'll map out 50 weeks of content for you. And the process is fairly simple, but I'll sit down either myself or one of the people on my team that I've trained to do this, and we'll take an area of expertise that you have. Right. So like I'm going to use podcasting as an example because that's one of my areas of expertise. And we're going to build 5, maybe 6 categories of content. And we can dive into any of this if you want to, but I'll just do real high level. You build a 10 Commandments series. And 10 Commandments they don't have to be commandments. There doesn't have to be 10 of them, but it's just the idea that like we're going to create the rules of engagement for your world, right? Where you're going to say like, if I could craft the perfect client, they would follow all of these rules, right? For your business. And so you build those 10 commandments and those end up being your first 10 episodes. Then you're going to build an FAQ series, which is the frequently asked questions. And so frequently asked questions are the questions that you get all the time in your business, right? If you're a chiropractor, it's like, I sit at the desk all day. What should I do with my, I get lower back pain, right? The questions you get asked all the time. Answer those questions. Those are your next series. You want to try and come up with at least 10 of them. Right, then my third one's my favorite category is your should ask questions. These are the questions you wished your audience would ask you if only they knew what you did about your topic. So in the world of podcasting, one of mine is are you siloing your post-production? Right. And it's the kind of thing that nobody ever is going to ask themselves that question because they don't know anything about post-production or siloing tasks. Right. But as soon as you explain it to them and you show them what a siloed post-production process looks like and how it impacts their ability to distribute stuff, they're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's an aha moment. So anytime you should ask a question and then answer it for someone, you give someone an aha moment, you create reciprocity, you create more of that authority, and you help become the kind of person they really want to listen to. So that's your third category. You want to come up with 10 of those. And then you want to come up with your limiting and empowering beliefs, right? Limiting beliefs are beliefs that if your audience has them are holding them back from taking action. Empowering beliefs are beliefs that they have that would, encourage them to take action. And so you're going to come up with your limiting and empowering beliefs for your area of expertise, right? In podcasting, it's things like if I put out a podcast, nobody's going to listen to me. That's a limiting belief, right? Empowering belief would be like, hey, if I show up consistently, it's actually going to help grow my business, those kind of things. So you have limiting, empowering beliefs that you can create content on. Then you have myths and truths, right? Myths about your topic and the actual truth that goes along with it. And then, one of the ones I've started using recently has been is mistakes to avoid. Right, about with your area of expertise. And when you do all of those, if you can come up with 10 in each of those categories, you'll end up with between 50 and 60 pieces of content, which gives you a weekly topic for your podcast every single week. And then the next sort of step along that is to take a list of your potential guests, right, that you could bring on for topics. And so it could be any one of those topics you can take and be like, hey, do I know someone in town or someone online or someone who we could talk about this topic together, and start building a guest list of people that you can bring on as well. So you can start interspersing, topical content with guest content to get both of those leverage points of the authority that comes from creating that content and the relationship prospect building when you're talking to people that's on there. And now you've got a year and a half's worth of, topics, so to speak. And then the next step from there is outlining that content. So you actually have like a recording outline. Like you guys actually have a question set that you guys sent me ahead of time of like, hey, what are we going to talk about on this podcast? Right. So how do you do that? So we teach people how they do that process. And it's the 30,000 foot, 30-second version of that is I call it the WIN framework. What, why, how, now, WWHN is what's the topic? Why is it important? How are we going to do, how are we going to talk about it? And now that we've covered it, what should you do next kind of thing? And we actually have a whole document that teaches you how to do a pretty in-depth recording outline for yourself. So you got all of those things at the beginning, right? And that's just prepping for consistency over time, right? Because the questions that people have, how do I make sure I look and sound good, right? Because if I don't look and sound good, I'm not going to record. That's why you get your studio set up. What am I going to talk about? That's what we do the content planning for. Once I hit the record button, what do I say? That's what the content outlining is for. So we do all of those processes. And if you want, I have both the content planning document and the content outlining document. We can send those to you. You guys can put them in the show notes for this, so people can have access to those documents. Perfect.
I'm sure our listeners would not mind if you allow us to do.
So it's like we'll make sure you get the notes. Yeah, so you'll have in the show notes, there'll be a link to our training on how you set up the studio stuff, and we'll give one of the documents that's how to set up how to do your content planning, and then one that's how to do your content outlining, which is where you take the topic and outline what you're going to actually talk about. Even if it's at the guest interview, the how section ends up being the questions you're going to ask your guest to cover all those things, and we cover all of that in the document.
Beautiful.
It's just a training document, PDF, real simple. But that's like sort of the first step of the process is we want to make sure that all the foundational stuff is ready to go. So we do that.
Well, to take a step
and then
back,
we create all the assets.
before we even get
Go
into
ahead.
this, like to take a step back for anybody that's sort of like, when you breathe here and you think about what you just did, you have eliminated a huge part of what keeps podcasts back. And if you guys were to actually go look at the stats of how many people, have tried to do a podcast and how many have only put out, a very minute amount of episodes, it's because they ran into
2
that
million
problem.
podcasts a year are started.
Right.
2 million are started. Less than 20,000 make it past their 10th episode, which is less than 1%.
Well, and the reason being is because most people run into a couple of key things. The first is that they start doing it and they realize this is bad. This doesn't look good. It doesn't sound good. This is actually making me look worse than I need to be. The second is like when you're trying to do this and you're doing it a week at a time and you have no planning, it becomes a panic moment. And there's times when the kid has a school play that night, and you're like, well, I didn't get to it this week. You lose your consistency. And once you lose your consistency a little bit in the beginning, it is incredibly difficult to get back on that train when you're first starting. And so, what I'm hearing, Richard, is you really take care of a lot of those key things in the beginning that hold people back from getting to that 10th episode, which is incredibly important. I remember when we got our 10th episode done and I was like, I can keep doing this, but I can't keep doing this on a consistent basis. And the reason I couldn't do it is because of where I think you're going next with this. Okay. So we get those things done. What's next?
Yeah, and the other thing I want to point out too is a lot of things where people don't actually make it past their 10th episode is because they're thinking to themselves, I'm building that media podcast, and when they get their 10 episodes out and they realize they haven't made a bunch of money from their advertising because they don't have 100,000 listeners yet, they're trying to build the wrong thing. So if they're building the right thing, then they start to realize, okay, where is this effort going towards? It's going towards creating this strategic influence in my marketplace. That's where there's a motivation for that consistency over time that is not tied to your viewership numbers.
Right. And I think that's the number one thing, man. It's like most of the people that are listening to this right now are not going to be building the kind of podcast that Joe Rogan has. It's just not, it's not going to happen. You have to set yourself up to where
it's not what you want to build either.
Right. No, exactly. I don't want that. There's plenty of podcasts out there that are in that category that are very entertaining to me, but that's not the kind of podcast that I want to actually build. And I think most people listening to this, that's not the podcast that you need to be aiming at building either. It's understanding that your podcast is serving a different purpose. And if you're looking at it that way, it's very easy to get a return on your investment within those first 10 episodes. Because you're strategically aiming at what is a success metric that you should be after. And, for me, it's amazing when you are focused on that, how quickly you see a return. Serial Progress Seeker podcast. We're not trying to reach 1 million people an episode. It's just that's not our thing. There is a very defined thing that each episode is supposed to be doing. And as long as it's doing that, the rest sort of kind of falls into place. And so keep going, man. I don't mean to keep you interrupting. I'm just this is gold.
My
so
goal
keep
for my
it up.
podcast is one person, right? If there's one person generally that each podcast is for. And sometimes the person that the podcast is for is the guest that's on the other side, right? The person that I'm interviewing.
Yeah.
And it's like when you start to realize that, like, hey, you can use the different success metrics and really grow your company that way. It's super powerful. The next sort of step is to create all those assets, right? So we create the intros, we create the outros, we create the commercials that are all sort of promoting your business. We want to make sure they got good calls to action in them that are driving people into them. We're going to create the podcast page on your website that has like the archive of the podcast. Make sure that those have calls to action on the tops and the sides and inside the actual content there. We're going to make sure that there's like spots for the transcription because we want to make sure the transcript shows up for Google. So you're getting the SEO benefit from all of those things. And we're just sort of connecting all of these pieces together. So we get everything set up properly so that you have a good YouTube presence, you have a good iTunes presence, and that you own all of those assets, right? So we make sure that you have a business YouTube account and we're added as a manager. We make sure that you have a business iTunes account and that we're added as a manager. And so you own all those assets. We make sure that your podcast website has the transcript ability, it has everything else, so that you're getting the SEO benefits, and again that you own all the assets for it. And so we're really intentional about like content ownership and all those kind of things where you own everything. So even if tomorrow you decide you didn't like the cut of our jib, or you don't like my passive aggressive flag on the back of my my podcast thing, that you're not losing anything, right? And we even do things like we're using shared drives on Google Drive, which allows for, if you ever used My Drive in Google Drive, there's all sorts of ownership permissions problems on who owns what document because it's based on who created it. We use shared drive, so everything is owned by the drive. And then if you guys don't like us anymore, you just kick us out of the drive and it's all yours, right? And so we create all of those things. And that's like, so the first 4 weeks is we're going to create all these assets. We're going to hire our voice actors. We're going to hire our graphic designers. We're going to make it you'll look like $1 million. Like, that's the idea, is that you want to look professional and sound professional, and all the production is high quality stuff. So you look and sound good. And it's the kind of thing that now that you see all this stuff and you see how good the quality is, it's the kind of thing that you're going to be like, I want to do more of this because it makes me look amazing. Right. And so we're trying to get to nail those kind of things where you're like, oh, these guys are, it makes me look like a professional, because you are, right? That's our goal, is we want you to, your professional aspects of your business, right? Because, I'm going to use you as an example. You were a chiropractor, right? You were good at what you did. And the way that people are going to look at your podcast is if you show up and your audio quality isn't good, if your intros are terrible, your voiceovers are shoddy, anything that is not up to at least a decent standard, that's going to reflect on how people, even if it's subconscious, how they think about how you're going to provide service to them in their business, right? As a chiropractor, even if you're an amazing chiropractor.
I just want to hug you right now. And I don't even know, I mean, there are so many people that I preach this to every day, Richard. And, some people get it, some people don't. But when I tell people your website has to be at a certain quality, your Facebook page has to be at a certain quality, the quality of your audio coming out of your mic, if you do anything, your video has to be a certain quality. And it's not that it's like, oh, we want this to be, but
it doesn't need to be Hollywood.
It doesn't have to be complicated, but it has to be at a level, because people subconsciously judge the quality of what goes on inside of your business based on what is the quality of you online. And, this is the number one thing I try to get across to small businesses. Yes. Thank you. And it's those unconscious trust signals are so important. So, and I think that this is an incredibly important part of it. The point that you're making is it does not have to be anything crazy expensive, but there's attention to detail that you take your customers through at Push Button Podcast that get them to the level to where, without them having to think about it, with them just being able to come sit down and go when it's time to go, get them to where they need to be. And I think that that's the other thing, the other thing that I'm really big on lately is, can you sit down, push a couple buttons and go? Because if you can't, if you have to do all this stuff because it's not, you don't have a defined area, you don't have a process down, you lose a lot of your momentum. You lose your consistency because it's such a pain in the ass to set everything up.
That's literally why I built the my little backdrop remote for my backdrop here. I mean, it did take me 3 whole minutes of my time to hang up my backdrop, but taking that 3 minutes and turning into a single button click means that I am more likely to set it up and do the work, right? So, and for I always recommend for people, if you have the opportunity to set up a permanent recording location, that's the best way to do it, right? Because you want to just be able to come in, sit your ass down on a chair and click the record button and go, right? That's ideal world. We don't all live in ideal world, right? I travel full time in an RV. This is a back bedroom of my RV. And if I pull this down, you would see a bed behind me, right? But so I need to set it up and I have to set up and take things down, but it's got to be easy.
I need to pause for a second, and I hope none of our listeners get mad at us because we want to get back into the core stuff. But this is incredibly important. I have people that tell me, well, Ben, I don't have a setup for this. I don't have enough room for this. We've never done this before. So my current office or my current home situation, is maybe not ideal. And I don't buy into that 99% of the time. Richard, you do this from an RV. Not only do you do your podcast, but you run your entire business from an RV. And that's the thing. I never know where Richard is going to be when I reach out to him. I never know. I have no clue what part of the country Richard's going to be when I reach out to him, but he's always doing something fun. And that's the thing. It's because you have this defined space in your space that you can do things and you can get it set up quickly. You can do the work. And that's the thing. Richard, I show up, you know, it's a very charmed life, but it's because we've gone through this process that you're talking about. I literally show up 4 hours a month and everything's ready for me. I sit down, I hit record, I talk, or I get to hang out with cool people like you, and then I'm out. And then like Richard, I remember the moment, and I think that this is probably a testimonial you get from every client probably within a month of 2 months. And correct me if I'm wrong. But they start to tell you that the people that are around them, their friends, their family, their customers, their people that are brand new coming in, they say this. All of a sudden, you were just in my feed all the time. All of a sudden, you were just everywhere. It's like you were there before, and I saw you, and I knew you existed. But all of a sudden, you were everywhere. And this is the common thing. And I remember when we got consistent with the podcast and consistent with the process that you're talking about that Push Button Podcast does, everybody was like, man, you're really stepping it up. And I was like, am I? I was like, what am I? Oh, yeah, that's right. Because my workload had actually gone way down. And I think that is the benefit of kind of where you're going in this process you're walking us through.
That's the goal.
So tell
actually.
me more.
And people always ask me when we do our sales calls. Our sales calls is always like, it's like, what's my success metric if it's not viewership? And I'm like, the success metric is what people are saying to you when they walk in the door, right? And if you ever ask that question, well, where did you hear about me? Every fucking where. That's where I heard about you, right? Like it's like I couldn't get away from you. You were everywhere. You were on my TikTok feeds. You were on my Facebook feeds, and it's like some of the things that we're doing with like local businesses is we don't actually do this, but we have a game plan we give to people, and like we have some training. I don't know if you know Liana, who's the CEO over at AdSkills now. We're actually doing some training with them on how to hire someone in house to run content advertising, because content advertising is not direct response advertising. It's significantly simpler, and it's as simple as like boost this post just to all the people who live in within 3 miles of my office kind of thing. Costs you like pennies, and then like everyone in town sees you every single day whether they like it or not. It's super easy to manage too, and it's like those are the kind of things that particularly for local businesses, man, you can just show up everywhere all the time. And our goal with Push Button Podcasts, and my goal, if you run this for your own company, is that you should never have to put in more than 2 to 4 hours worth of work, and it should only be start, record, stop, record. That's the end of your job, right? And then everything else needs to have a process that's handled for you, whether that's you have someone on your staff that's doing it, or you hire someone like us to do it. In order for you to do what you do in your company, you need to do your highest and best work, and making sure that you're doing video editing and graphic design and publishing everything there. That is not your highest and best use as the CEO of your company.
No. And I think that, I've had people that have come to me behind your back and said, hey, I'm struggling with this. The podcast actually makes us money, but like, I can't keep up with it. And that's my thing is I tell them, like, this is your guy. This is why you are good at this. You were good at this one thing. And listen, if you continue to hone your skills at this one thing that you're good at, not that you're not kind of good at all this other stuff, which is the graphic design, which is the, audio editing, which is all this stuff, like that's not the thing that's going to make you money. That's not the thing that's going to grow your business. What is going to grow your business is you continue to put in the hours. Like, there's one thing in my business, Richard, that right now, Serial Progress Seeker, that I am incredibly good at. I have put 10,000 hours in. I have put 20,000 hours in at this point, but the more time that I'm able to put into that skill, the more of a return our company gets on that skill. And so this podcast is such an important piece of the puzzle, but if I am focusing on all of the things that make this podcast work, I'm not putting more time into the things that really bring us, cash. and really bring us satisfied customers that are going to tell their friends about us. And so, yeah, I think that that's the thing is it's like, you really have to look at this. And I think this just goes right back to what we talked about earlier. And you were like, you just told me to get somebody to come in and help me and to do the work. And if you're on one side of it, where you're like, I want to do a podcast, but I can't afford to bring somebody in to help me, whether that be you or they bring somebody in on their own staff. The amount of time that you save yourself by hiring someone to do this or paying someone else to do these things, whether that be Push Button Podcast or somebody else, puts you in a space where your income earning ability goes way up. And that's the thing. This podcast is everybody's window into our world. This podcast is our excuse to connect with people that are potential partners. But if this podcast was once again left only to me, we would be in great trouble, great trouble if I was doing all of the work to do this. And so that's the big thing. So success metrics, I think the success metric for us, before I ask you the next piece of this puzzle, the success metric for us, Richard, is simply this. It's, are we fostering quality relationships with people that turn into business? I mean, almost right away. And it's amazing to me as this podcast has evolved, how that has happened, whether it being we're selling courses, I'm a course seller. The courses that we have sold go up because of this podcast now, but also, there's some partnerships that have happened and high ticket things that we sell now that happens specifically because of who our guest was that week. And it's amazing.
Yeah.
And if I was focused on all the production of this, those things could not happen because I couldn't do, the things that back it up. And so the next thing is when you're putting out content for podcasts, because one of the things that you do, you not only put out the podcast, but you put out the snippets, you put out, the things to like TikTok, to Instagram, to Facebook. So that's more of your short form content. And I don't want us to go too deep in this because I've already taken up enough of your time. This is one of those where people are going to write me and they're going to say, get Richard back as quickly as possible. But the question that I want to ask you is this: what is kind of your schedule typically for, let's say that it's a lawyer and they're doing a podcast. What is your schedule for like putting their stuff on networks like TikTok, and YouTube Shorts, the short form content? What does that normally look like if they record if they come in and they do 2 hours of recording a month? What are they getting weekly that's going up on those networks in terms of long form and short form content?
So long form content, and this is the schedule I recommend for everyone, right?
Sure.
And it almost doesn't matter which space you're in, because I found it is, especially with short form content, it is more important to show up all the time than it is to show up on a specific schedule or with a specific set of things. So what we do is we do long form video. Long form video is for YouTube. There's some other players that are starting to come up in that space, like Rumble, and so we might start putting some stuff onto Rumble. But mostly, like, YouTube has like 99% of the market still, so it's right. YouTube for long form video, and that's going to have titles, thumbnails, descriptions, links back to the blog post, right? Backlinks is SEO play, right? So that's the first one, and then you're going to have long form audio. That's iTunes. Right, iTunes should have the same kind of thing in the feed. You should have the description. You should have the custom graphic that goes for each episode. You should have the transcription that goes along with it, because all that stuff gets put into the SEO feed. So you want to find all of those things. And again, links back to your website, more backlinks. Right, so those are two long form ones. And we do those first because then we get the embed codes for both of those, and then we take the long form and we create a piece on the website, which is show notes, resources, transcription, links to everything, YouTube embed, iTunes embed, and again, the purpose of all of that. And then everything else that we create all links back to that post on the blog, right? So we go back and we'll update the iTunes link and we'll update the YouTube description to link back into the blog once it's been created, so that it's all sort of interconnected. So there's some SEO plays that are happening there. And that's all your long form content. You're hitting your three biggest distribution networks there, which is YouTube for video, Apple for audio, and then your blog for Google search engine. Your three biggest distribution platforms are all hit with the long form content. And let's just assume your publishing day was Monday, right? So we publish those on Monday, right? And let's say it's Monday morning, 10 a.m., those go out. And then there'll be, along with that, there'll be announcements that go out to social media, right? And just simple announcements. Hey, new podcast episode is out, and that's going to go out on every one of the platforms that you're connected to include Google Local Business, which is more important now than it used to be. And they just opened this up in November of this last year. That even if you have a national brand like Serial Progress Seeker or Push Button Podcast, you can have a Google Local Business profile that has a national presence. That's brand new. So every one of your businesses should have that Google Local Business as well, and you should be publishing the social content onto it as well, because I added all of that in. So we published all of that. That happens, assume that's Monday. And then each one of those long form content pieces, we're going to create at a minimum 6 pieces of short form content. And the short form content is we're going to create 3 different types of each one. So it's variations. We're going to create the portrait short form video. And then we're going to create a wide video and a square video, which is useful for like Instagram versus, TikTok. Sure. And for each of those, we're going to create a headline, and we're going to create the transcript for it, and we're going to create the actual video template that goes along with it. The transcript is a super important part, not because we're going to use the transcript for anything other than maybe the captions, but we actually take the transcript, then we're using things like ChatGPT now to here's the transcript of this video, and I want you to rewrite the transcript as good written content for Facebook or for TikTok. Nice. And then it won't like write out of, to use a biblical term, ex nihilo. It's not going to just create stuff. It'll actually use your tone of voice and your language and your words from the transcript and rewrite it as a well-written Facebook post. And so we'll do that for all of the major platforms. So you'll have custom captions I call it captions, but custom, like the social post text that goes along with the video. And we create all of those and make sure that there's a link back to the blog post on all of them on your website. And then we publish those, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And so then you have original content coming out 365 days a year. And then what we do is say we get like 2 months into the process now, we've got all this original content coming out every single day. One of our AI tools that we're using now actually looks at all the stuff that's engaging well. And we start putting them into a recycled hopper kind of thing, where it's like, hey, if this video did well, it gets to go into the recycled hopper. And now, say we're publishing original content at 10 a.m. and then at noon and at 3 and at 6, recycled content is coming out as well. So now you're getting to the point where you're publishing 2, 3, 4 times a day with your short form content on a daily basis, on top of your original content that's coming out. And all of that's coming from that one leveraged recording session at the beginning of the month.
So 2 hours, that you put into recording this. Yeah. And that's all you get. No, I mean, and this is, I think this is the key for everybody that's listening. It's how do you leverage technology and tools to be ever present? And I think that's the thing, is it's how are you ever present in a high quality way in front of your market? And, I think that this is the thing, is it's just like people underestimate, sometimes when you're running, Richard, that quote unquote media type podcast, or you think that's where you're supposed to be going, people get really like locked into how many views did this get. But I tell you, one of the main things that has served us and a lot of the people that we help, do this podcast thing, especially the video podcast thing, is just how many times they're flashing across the feeds. That matters.
Impression volume.
Yeah,
it matters so much.
And it's like used to, Richard, before all this fun stuff, you could drive down the road and you'd see a billboard on your way to and from work. And, if those billboards were effective because maybe you didn't need that service right now, but it was just started to embed in your brain, or that radio commercial that would just kind of play in the background every so often. You didn't really notice it, but it was there. But that was expensive. It was incredibly expensive to do those things. Now we're in a place to where if you can put 2 hours into your month into talking about something you're already an expert in, and you've got this system behind it. And I think that, that's the thing, getting this system behind it, all of a sudden you were daily in front of people multiple times. And I know you have more thoughts on that. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, being ever present is so powerful. And it's like, I mentioned this before, my podcast has maybe 400 regular listeners to it. I don't think a single one of my regular listeners is a client of mine.
Right.
I really want to drive that home. That's it. Like, the people who listen to my podcast are not my clients. The people who are my clients are the ones who are like, you show up every day talking about podcasting. So, right. Like that's how we that's how we show up. So like when you're showing up, like I'm in your feed every day talking about chiropractic, we're talking about legal stuff, we're talking about all the things that are happening in your town. Like you're the name, you're the face that everyone knows. You're building that relationship with them, and it's funny too because like I'll have people that I'll get on the phone with them now, either for sales calls or for the podcast, and people are like, "I can't believe I'm getting to talk to you. You're famous," and I'm like, "I'm not famous, right?
Well,
But people think I
but
am."
and I think that this is the thing on average, and I'm just going to throw this out here. On average, the vast majority of the customers that have spent $5,000-$10,000 with us in the last year, okay, we have them. We have every year we do these numbers, but the vast majority of customers that have spent $5,000 to $10,000 with us in the last year are the people that they've maybe listened to one of our podcasts, and that one that they listened to was very aimed at them, or they were on it, or they were the guest. And, that's the thing though, is it's like equating the two, listener base versus, what it's actually bringing us sales, because of what you're talking about, the amount of mass exposure that we get. Um, that's what turns into sales. That's what turns into those relationships that leads to those sales. And so when you start to, and I know what this podcast was originally supposed to be about. We kind of knew what we were coming here to talk about. Like, we sent Richard all these questions. We stuck to almost zero of these questions because this was just so much better, Richard. So thank you. Like, Richard, what you brought was the heat. But I think the thing that, really kind of hit me today, that is the big take home point, is the second that you can detach yourself from trying to run a traditional, what we think of podcast, when we're very much looking at it from an outside perspective, which is to try to run this media podcast. When you start looking at it a completely different way, there's almost no one out there that cannot profit from a podcast if you come into it looking at it like this. Like, there's almost no one out there that, whether you have a business right now that you want to attach the podcast to as a promotional engine, or you're thinking of starting a business, and the podcasting can be sort of the piece of the puzzle that gets you out there or gets you access to people. That's where this really is. And it's very, very true. And I'm so glad that you said it, because I think a lot of people are afraid to say this. A lot of people are afraid to say, well, these are my numbers and these are my listenership. And, it only becomes like this thing that people talk about when it's like huge numbers. And most of my friends that make more money than these people that are bragging about their listener bases, it's because they have a very small podcast that they're doing this exact model with. And this exact model is driving their business in such a powerful way that they actually enjoy that. When people look up their podcast, just be, oh, well, you're not on the charts. No, it's never been an aspiration. It's never been something we're into, because the money that is coming in, the business that's being generated, it does not require a lot of listeners. It does not require a lot of people subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's not what this is about, because the people that we are actually attracting with this podcast that we're putting together, the people that we're bringing in, they spend a lot of money, but they don't spend a lot of time subscribing to YouTube channels. They don't spend a lot of time listening to every episode we've ever put out. They're very focused in where their attention is put. And so I think that's key. The money spenders are typically the ones that don't fit into those categories. And so I love that.
I say you probably noticed yourself that like the movers and shakers, the people who are actually like who are out there making stuff happen, they don't have a lot of time to watch podcasts and
Right.
watch YouTube channels. They're doing things.
Yeah.
And so having it's like that, there's a reason why if you are going for mass populace, you make your money from advertising, right? Because
Yes.
it's a different model, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like what we're talking about is like I've gotten the CEOs of tech startups that have billions of dollars of funding to say yes to coming on my podcast, right?
Yeah.
I've got like the people that will say yes to come on. Like it's just such a huge leverage point, and I can't stress enough how valuable it is and how little time you have to put into it if you build the systems properly, right?
Yeah.
It is the biggest leverage play in my business. And I was like, we are going to, like I said, my business is going to cross $1 million monthly recurring revenue this year, probably, and probably be at 3 or 4 million by the end of next year. And
Super
it will
happy.
still not
Love it.
require more than 4 hours a week for my stuff. Like it's
Right.
insane.
Well, and so, I think the big take home lesson is this. It's if you go into this more strategically, and you look at the podcast as your ability to get access to people and your ability to, forge these relationships and build the leverage that Richard talked about in the beginning, massive things can come from running a podcast. And it doesn't take 6 months to a year to 2 years to build up this thing to where it's doing. I think that scares a lot of people away. It can start literally within your first 4 or 5 episodes. And it also gets much easier to stick with something in the beginning if you start to see those returns and you're looking at this the right way. So here's the problem. I have about 40 more questions that I want to ask Richard, but we don't have time on this episode. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, if I could find Richard, because he's always in a different location, so he's always hard to find, but I would go twist his arm. Richard, go ahead.
I'm in the same place for the next 6 months. We're not moving anywhere.
Beautiful.
We're in the process of
to
buy a sailing yacht so we can travel port to port around the world for the next couple of years. So for the time being, we're not moving anywhere.
So here's what we're going to do, you guys. This episode was absolutely chock full of stuff that you can take action on. But here's the thing. If you're looking to start a podcast right now, or even better, you've been doing this podcast thing for a while, but you've run into the same problems that most of us have, and you want to get more efficient, you want to pull more profit out of it, go check out Richard and the team at Push Button Podcast. We'll have links in all the show notes to you guys to get what you're going to do. And I promise I will get Richard back for more because, Richard, the things that Richard knows, as I said, way smarter than me. The things that Richard knows and the things that he will bring to the community that we're building with, what we're doing, teaching people how to run successful podcasts, I think is huge. And Richard, if you're cool with that, we're definitely going to bring you back all the time because it's just a blast to always get to hang, buddy. So
happily come and chat. I was like, we didn't even touch on like half the stuff we could talk about with podcasts and all the other things, and AI developments, all the other cool stuff that's going on. There's so many cool things we could talk about.
So we'll just make you a series regular, and hopefully you're cool with that. So listen, thanks to everybody that listened today. We are super, super happy with where our podcast has taken us, and we want you to be able to take your podcast to the same places. And if you listen to even half of what Richard gave you guys today, you're going to be in a really, really good spot implementing. And listen, if you're somebody that is like, hey, I want to do this, I want to follow those models, look up Push Button Podcast. They can make it a whole lot easier for you. And so, Richard, thanks for being here, buddy. And to all of our listeners, we appreciate you being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for checking out this episode of the Serial Progress Seeker Podcast. If you want to listen to more episodes, learn more about our mission, or send us questions or feedback about the show, go to serialprogressseeker.com. You can help the mission by subscribing, reviewing, rating, and commenting wherever you listen to or watch podcasts. And be sure to connect with us on social media for all the latest through Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. We'll catch you next time, Serial Progress Seekers.